Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, kicking off a new series based on a bunch of requests I've gotten from really quite a few of you. How do you find new pieces you're going to like based on one that you already know that you like? Now, this whole site is kind of a channel, pardon me, I think of websites, channel, whatever it is devoted to that process. But there are many ways to do it. And I know I make long lists and put things in clumps and stuff, and it's just so much music. It's just out of control, right? But there is another way, and I'm going to do it by reviving something that I did quite a few years ago in my very first book, Beethoven or Bust. This was published, oh my God, I don't know, by Anchor, I think. Who did publish it? Yes, Anchor Books, back at the dawn of time. I wrote it as a 25th birthday present to myself, actually, because I really wanted to sort of express my love of classical music. And it's dedicated to my brother Dan, who always supported me in this, and my sister Jody, who criticized something I did. And I cursed her out and screamed and shrieked and carried on, then realized she was right the whole time. It was published originally in 1961. No, that's when I was born. Sorry. 1992. All right, not so bad. And it had a few printings, and then it got deleted or cut out, and it's been gone ever since. I don't even know if Anchor Books still exists. Maybe they do. I have no clue. But there's a wonderful story behind this, which I think I should tell you. And you may find it fascinating because it really talks about how the publishing industry was changing in the 90s. It was doing the same thing the classical music industry was doing, by which I mean self-destructing or disintegrating. I wrote the book just on spec. I wrote it for myself, and I found an agent. The agent was a lovely, lovely lady who was a very serious literary agent in those days. She had some major authors under her wing, and she just liked the book, and she liked me, and she was really, really nice about it. So she took it on, and she placed it. She placed it with Prentice Hall. And Prentice Hall, in those days, was a major trade, what they call trade book. That's this thing, sort of a little bit larger than a regular paperback publisher. And they wanted this to be a flagship title for their trade division. And they paid me a huge advance. I mean, in those days, it was like thousands of dollars. Nowadays, you're lucky if you have to pay the publisher if you want your book published, unless you're someone like, Prince Harry or Kate, what's her name, Markle, or, they'll give you millions of dollars up front because, they'll publish 1 billion of them. But for classical music nowadays, it's impossible. You get nothing. Anyway, in those days, you still got money. I was dazzled. I was working in real estate in New York, and I actually placed a book. I was over the moon, and I was about 25 years old. So what happened? What happened was the book was going into publication. The contracts were all signed, and Prentice Hall's trade division was getting closed down. And my editor there was fired and was replaced by somebody else who was given marching orders to cancel the publication of the book and to reclaim their advance on the basis of the fact that the book was unpublishable. So they hired a person who turned out to be the mother of the editor, who was a music teacher, to read the book and trash every bit of it. And then they had their attorney send me a letter threatening to sue me if I didn't return the advance, which of course I'd spent and didn't have much money in those days. I mean, I wasn't wealthy. I'm not wealthy now, but I really wasn't wealthy then. And they threatened to sue me if I didn't return the book. So I spent an entire 24-hour period, didn't show up at work that day, writing a response, a line-by-line response to this witless trashing of the book. And it was moronic. It was ridiculous. It was easily rebutted, but I had to do it. So I wrote this 50-page rebuttal. And back in those days, I was using an Apple Macintosh computer, those little things, with less memory than your watch has now or whatever. And I got to the very end of it, and there was a power surge, and I lost the whole thing. And I just put my head in my hands and cried. I mean, what can you do, right? So then I picked myself up and spent another 24 hours rewriting the whole thing. And I took it to my agent and I went through it with her and her people. And she was furious. She said to me, I have never in all of my life seen this kind of behavior coming from a publisher. It's a disgrace. It's outrageous. Well, anyway, how we got around it is very, very interesting. She represented a major writer of romance fiction, who was dead, but it was still writing romance fiction. It's just like dead composers keep writing pieces. Ghostwriters were doing things and publishing it under this author's name, and it was still an industry. And Prentice Hall, or Prentice Hall's larger whatever, one of the publishing imprints in that company was this author's publisher. And she called them up and she said, okay, listen, you drop this lawsuit and cut this bullshit right now, and you set this thing free. You give us a release, you give us the manuscript back, or else you are no longer going to be this famous billion money-making author's publisher. And she did that for me, which was, to this day, I'm grateful. She passed away a few years later. She was an older lady, but just a class act, and it was an unbelievable experience with the publishing industry. And of course, then the publishing industry kind of collapsed, but they found a publisher, and it came out as this, Beethoven or Bust. It was originally going to be called the Prentice Hall Guide to Great Music or something like that. And they bought an ISBN number. You can actually still find it on Amazon. It's listed, but it was never published. So that's how this came out. Now, this was my first book, and it was, a practical guide to understand and listening to great music, and it's very, very out of print. But at the back of it, I had come up with this concept, which I think is really a valid one, and I'm going to try it here. It was to find groups of 4 works, and to relate them in some way, just 4 pieces, because, as some of you have mentioned, it's an overwhelming thing. There's just so much music, and you're not going to remember it all. And to keep it all straight, I really understand. I get it. And there are people in classical music who love that, who just wallow in it, like me, for example. But there are also people who need to take their time, who need to take it in smaller doses, who want to really, really soak in each work individually, and they're never going to listen to 400,000 pieces of music in their lifetime, and so what? It's perfectly fine. So what I had here was I fancied it, a sort of conceit here, a piano keyboard, 88 listening groups. Each group consists of 4 works. The first 2 works, I call them A and B and 1 and 2. A and B are works that were composed at around the same time. So if you like works in a certain style or of a certain period, you may want to hear those 2 pieces and let them be an entree into music of that period. So we're talking about very popular pieces for the most part here. Then there are accessories 1 and 2. A goes with 1, B goes with 2. Those are works written later, considerably later, by different composers. And you can use A and B to get you into works 1 and 2. In other words, there are things to follow up with because they have things in common with A and B. So you have a hook and a way to get into those composers and those works. So I'm going to try it. I'm going to run through the series from the book. My own book, actually. I've wanted to go back and do this for a long time because I looked at them again, and some of them are kind of interesting. I think it really works. I really do. I got very good response when I did it. So group 1 consists of 2 works written approximately at the same time. They are Haydn's Symphony No. 102, considered by many to be his greatest symphony, and Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, considered by many to be Mozart's greatest symphony. The Haydn was written in 1795, the Mozart in 1788. So they're only 7 years apart, and they are iconic works in the classical style. Now, if you listen to the 2 of those, presumably, hopefully, you'll hear the essence of the classical symphony. Those wonderful, shapely melodies, perky, perky development sections where all the motives and ideas are played with and displayed in different emotional environments. Beautiful singing slow movements. You'll also hear the difference between Haydn and Mozart as composers. Mozart, the quintessential writer of vocal music, of long lyrical lines, and also the master of pathos, of staying in a minor key, and it's just beautiful. But Haydn is, especially in Symphony No. 102, almost a predecessor, definitely a predecessor. I mean, he was a predecessor of Beethoven. He was Beethoven's music that's more rugged, more eruptive, more surprising, less regular in its phrasing. Really very, very well contrasted works, although recognizably in a similar classical style. Now, I've done many videos about the classical style and about Haydn. We're in the middle of the Haydn Symphony Crusade and Mozart, so you can follow up with those if you'd like. Now, the pieces I team them up with, and I'm putting all of this information, right below this video, so I'm just giving you a little introduction to it now. The Haydn Symphony No. 102, I team up with Prokofiev's Classical Symphony. Now, the Prokofiev Classical Symphony was written in 1917. Wow, it's a lot later than 1795, but it was written in an overtly classical style. It was an attempt at Prokofiev's, as it was actually sort of a graduation exercise when he was in conservatory. It's a brilliant, brilliant work that attempts to reimagine what a classical symphony would sound like with modern harmony and very typically Prokofiev-y tunes. One of the movements in it, the dance movement, the gavotte, I think it is, reappeared in his ballet Romeo and Juliet, which sort of tells you where it's coming from. But it has a lot of Haydn's perkiness, his wit, its spikiness, particularly if you listen to the finale of the Haydn and the finale of Prokofiev's Classical Symphony and its first movement. You hear the similarity quite obviously. And to team up with Mozart's Symphony No. 40, the comparison is with Schubert's Symphony No. 5, because Schubert's fifth is his most Mozartian symphony. It was written in 1816. So it's about 20 years later, but it's in a very obviously Mozart style. The scoring is very similar for strings and just a small handful of winds, no trumpets, no timpani. And it's also full of gorgeous, long-breathed, beautiful, beautiful melodies with that touch of pathos. Even though it's in a major key rather than Mozart's minor, G minor, you hear that beautiful, beautiful twilight, always on the verge, happiness on the verge of tears, or tears on the verge of happiness, depending on how you do it. But it's a clear, what's the word? Successor, thank you. Logical successor to Mozart's G minor symphony and the Mozartian style more generally, before Schubert went on to other cosmic things, which he did as he progressed. So that's the first group. And like I said, I'm listing it below, A and B, 1 and 2, and then which comparisons you should make. A to B, A to 1, B to 2, and just follow it that way and start with this small group, just this small group of 4 works. And if you listen to those and take your time doing it, I think you'll begin to get a sense of individual composers' styles versus the common practice of a certain period in our musical history, and also the commonalities in our musical tradition that span the centuries. Hopefully that will give you a little help, and we'll be doing these as a new series, and depending on how it's received and how well how useful you find it. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Thank you for listening to the story of my first book. Take care.